Welcome to AAUW Connections. Tonight we're going to be talking about a problem that is a very serious problem, but one that most of us, I believe, always thought just exists in other parts of the world, in underdeveloped parts of the world, in Asia or Africa or some, and it does, but now we're learning it happens here too, and that is the topic of human trafficking. More and more we're realizing that it can happen anywhere. And here to tell us about it, we have two representatives of the Bay Area Anti Trafficking Coalition, which we'll sometimes refer to as, is it BAATC?
Or BAATC.
BAATC. And they are Judith Hamilton, who is a very active member, an abolitionist with BAATC, and Brian Woe, who is one of the co-founders, who's a co-founder and director of the organization. So, in talking about human trafficking, why don't we start first by defining what is human trafficking?
Well, a simple definition would be when one person is exploited for their work by another party. And there's three elements that law enforcement looks for, and that's either force, fraud, or coercion.
Force, fraud, or coercion.
So okay. Force could be the Hollywood-style grab off the street and throw in a van, which doesn't happen very often. But fraud is more often offering someone a job or luring them with some other tactic to become a trafficking victim. And coercion can just be any type of threatening their families or threatening them and their own welfare so that they can be exploited.
Now, does it always involve, I know I tend to think of it as that person, that victim, being transported to another area where they then engage in whatever they're being forced to do, and they are slaves. I assume that's why you refer to yourself as an abolitionist, because they are slaves. So what about, are they always transported?
No, it is modern day slavery, and people are sometimes transported into the country or around the country, but crossing a border is smuggling, whereas trafficking can happen to someone while they're trafficking victims who have been living in their own homes, that while someone else has been exploiting them for their sex or labor. Even
while they're living in their own homes?
Yes.
Well, that's so, and it doesn't always, and does it always or often involve that person being sold? I mean, as a commodity, or just forced to do something that they don't want to do?
They're sold as a commodity, and one of the reasons that it's gaining such momentum is that it's a product that can be sold and sold and sold over again. Mm-hmm. The drug cartels, which are the biggest illegal profit factor that we have now found that human trafficking comes up second. And in drug trafficking, you have to buy new product. You have to keep supplying your customers with product. With human trafficking, you use it over and over and over again.
And that can either be, as you mentioned, one of you, I guess you did, Brian, that in the sex trade, or it could be in the labor market.
That's right.
So at first, when you started to talk about drug trafficking, I thought we were going down the path that said that they sell labor, but you're just saying that's the most illegal trafficked commodity.
But the two entities are very much alike in many ways, and they have begun to consider sharing sources because they already have their traffic patterns established and they have their money laundering facilities established. So it makes it ideal for a partnership for those two illegal activities to be working under the same umbrella.
They go hand in hand.
That is really particularly frightening when you consider how well organized some of the drug cartels are, and they have all their distribution methods and transportation, and wow, that's really scary. Now, who mainly are the victims of human trafficking? Are they more boys than girls? Are they young children rather than adults? Is there one category that's more prevalent than others?
There are 29 million people they estimate to be involved as in human trafficking. 80% of those are women or girls, and that, 50% are children. The other
50% of the 80%.
Yes, are children, and then 20% are boys and men.
So when we hear about boys in Africa being forced into the military and taught to kill or whatever, or being forced to do horrendous types of labor, and they're just kids, really. That's the minor part. That isn't the majority.
That's still about half of the victims. The children are obviously the least powerful and the easiest to exploit. And around the world, women as well. So that's why you have such high figures of women and children.
Now, in reading some of the material, I've gotten the impression there's a distinction is made between voluntary and involuntary victims. What would be an example of a voluntary victim?
Well, we have madams in this country who, live very high lifestyles that have chosen to make their living that way and enjoy the luxury of it.
But is that woman a victim of human trafficking?
No.
She's a perpetrator.
She's one, yes. The victims are those who are forced into it.
Okay, so are the victims all involuntary? Is there such a thing as a voluntary?
There's a thing that happens with victims. They get into the sex trafficking, and frequently they're attracted because someone's been kind to them. They've offered to take care of them. They've fed them. They've clothed them. They've shown them attention, and that's one of the prime characteristics of those who succumb to trafficking is that they're looking for love.
So what may appear voluntary is really a subtle form of psychological manipulation, where the trafficker has formed this bond where the victim depends on them completely and ends up only trusting them. So they may not want to leave them, but that doesn't mean they're not a trafficking victim. And that doesn't mean they're not experiencing horrible abuse.
And I guess it doesn't mean that even though it started as a quasi-voluntary situation, it then becomes certainly involuntary if that victim has any ideas of getting out of whatever that activity is, correct?
Correct.
Now, let's talk a little about labor trafficking as well. Is labor trafficking predominantly in certain industries, or could it be any kind of labor? Where do you find labor trafficking?
Agriculture.
Sure.
Hotels. We find that people working as chambermaids in that area. And you will find, let's see, Brian.
Restaurants.
Restaurants, yes.
The first human trafficking case to be tried in Northern California courts was a domestic servitude case. So someone who was brought into the country to work in someone's home, cook and clean and whatnot, but often in these cases, and there have been many of them in suburban areas around the Bay Area and all of California, they get their papers taken away, they're made to sleep on the floor, they're not paid, they're abused, and they become labor trafficking victims, and that can happen in any suburban neighborhood.
There was an incident a couple of years ago where they found the first trafficking victim in that area, and what had happened was some people at the school noticed that this nanny was bringing the children in every day to school. She wore the same dress every day for a month and did not make eye contact, with very shy and reticent. And somebody questioned that, and that led to an investigation which discovered she had been trafficked for quite a while.
And you also mentioned that in hotels and hospitality, chambermaids. I never thought about that. I just never thought about it. But
sure.
So they are often. Is there one person, say in a hotel, where you have the chambermaids? Is it one crew boss or whatever who brings all these girls in? Somebody has to supply them. The girls didn't somehow come, or the women, from wherever they came from, I mean another country or whatever, and go fill out a form. Are there contractors? How does that work?
There could be. So another thing that you might see is you might recognize a house down your street that people seem to be living in the garage, and they leave early in the morning all in a van, they come late at night, and they could be going to work at a restaurant or a hotel or something, and they end up being in a system called debt bondage, where they come from a poor country and they need to feed their family. They pay a huge recruiting fee to a recruiter to come get a job in the U.S.
Oh my goodness, they actually pay.
They actually pay to get the job, and they think that's the dream that they can go actually provide for their family. But then the traffickers charge on all these high interest rates and fees for housing and food, and they can never actually pay back the debt they owe. So they are indentured servants in that sense.
We had a really sad case that brought my attention to human trafficking when I found out a restaurant I'd been eating at in Sunnyvale was owned by a man who had trafficked 21 young teenage girls from India with the promise to their parents that he would give them a high school education. Well, the parents paid for them to come over here. When they arrived, they were not enrolled in any school. They were sold as sex slaves and used in his restaurants and apartments to clean and do labor work like that, and never paid. And there was no way they were ever going to be freed of the bondage that they had with the bondage.
So he was himself the trafficker.
Yes, he was. And 2 of the girls died, and that's how he was discovered.
Oh my goodness.
There was carbon monoxide poisoning in one of the apartments, and he since has faced the courts.
Now, how did you, that just brings up the question of, you said, how did you first become aware of this problem and become involved, become an abolitionist, if you will?
Well, I took a class on social justice, and we studied many different aspects. And at the end of the class, we were asked to choose one that we felt resonated in our hearts. And human trafficking to me was kind of interesting. So I started looking up, and I actually went to the Global Forum and the Freedom Summit.
And tell us, what is the
Global Forum was put on by Not for Sale. It was an international conference of people focusing on human trafficking. And then the Freedom Summit, which was put on by Area Anti Trafficking Coalition, I had literally a couple thousand people come and talk about what was going on, and you could go around to different workshops and find out what was going on. And at that point, I also discovered there was 2 brothels on the street where my daughter used to take ballet lessons. I never expected to find that much in my own community of Sunnyvale. And that really irritated me, and that passage came to mind. It says, once you have seen it, you can never again say you didn't know. And I had to do something.
And Brian, how about you?
Well, I first heard about the subject in 2008 through a film called Call and Response. And that was kind of in a season of my life where I was exploring more of what it meant to stand against injustice. And my family, my wife and I got more involved in over the next couple of years through our church, but then felt like we were being called to a new season of going deeper into this issue. And so I left my position where I was a pastor, and we began to look at what we could do. I met my current colleague, Betty Ann Boving, who co-founded the BAATC with me. While she was planning the Freedom Summit in 2011, we got this glimpse of anti-trafficking in the Bay Area was a lot of nonprofits, a lot of schools, universities and high schools, a lot of faith communities, community groups like Rotary clubs wanted to do something or were doing something but not collaborating. So we were birthed out of the vision of helping everybody work together to share resources, not duplicate efforts, to develop best practices.
And when was this?
And this was in 2011, so almost 3 years ago.
Oh, okay.
So.
But even then, there was an awareness among groups, enough that there were these various groups who recognized that there was a serious problem here.
There's this window of awareness that we have an opportunity to really mobilize people, because they realize, as you mentioned, that trafficking doesn't just happen overseas. It happens right here in our backyards, and people can no longer hold it and push it to the margins of their consciousness. So they want to do something. And so part of our mission is to help people connect into the things that they can do.
Now, but speaking of trafficking in general, globally, are some kinds of trafficking more prevalent in some countries or in some continents than they are in others? For instance, in the United States, it's mostly some types of labor trafficking and sex trafficking, certainly, but maybe in Africa how does that work?
There are other types in different regions, but I mean, our focus is really on the Bay Area and looking at how all types of trafficking in the United States are found here in the Bay Area. And it's not just victims from overseas. The domestic victims, I think, are something that people are really realizing, that kids from the United States, kids in our schools, kids in our families, in our neighborhoods are being trafficked.
Just give us an example of a local kid somehow getting involved in a trafficking scheme.
Oh, okay. We have one right from Los Altos High School. Mm-hmm. A young girl, star soccer player, excellent student, went to UC Berkeley. Her senior year, she finally, when the last check was written for her tuition, she finally came forth and was able to address the fact that her parents had been selling her for sex for over 10 years. She had paid for her whole education and provided them with a living, and
So
had
she
been
was from
coerced
a
into it.
supposedly,
Yes.
apparently good home.
Yes, and none of her friends, none of her teachers, no one knew this was going on.
Wow.
She now happens to be one of the country's most effective speakers on rescuing human traffickers.
Oh, that's just
So it doesn't just happen to the urban inner city kind of stereotypical at-risk youth, but there are many populations like foster children, runaways, homeless kids that are very at risk. And as I think Judith alluded to earlier, the traffickers come at them to recruit them. They spot people who may be looking for some source of love and care, and they fill that and trick them into exploiting them.
In fact, you were earlier, before we were talking earlier about how this was on an international level, about how some traffickers went to some undeveloped countries or underdeveloped. How did they lure girls in? Tell us a little more.
Well, it's a promise of education. It's a promise of a job, and sometimes families will go into debt to finance the young person in the family to come to America and get a job. Well, they're already deeply in debt, and once they get here, there's no way they ever work their way out of that debt. The cost of their transportation, the cost of their room and board, always is more than they're ever making for the trafficker.
And you were also telling me about girls who are lured by someone who wants to be their sweetheart or their boyfriend. Is that
That's true. So I mean, they know how to spot someone who may just they may have just had an argument with their mom at home, and they've gone out in the street with their other girlfriends, and they make friends with them, and they start caring for them, giving them gifts, and it's easy to convince them sometimes that they're their boyfriend, and they come to trust them to the point where they force them to be exploited.
Now, are there certain states where there is more human trafficking than others in the United States? Is California one of a big, not Mecca, but you know what, is there more human trafficking in California, say, than in Iowa?
We are one of the top 10 states, and we have 3 cities that are the largest human trafficking centers.
And they are?
San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. And a very shocking statistic I found was that the Bay Area, with our 3 airports here, sells more sex tourist vacations than any other part of the country.
That's to go to other countries where
Yes.
young people have been enslaved.
Yes, you can buy sex vacations on the internet.
Oh.
But the good thing is that there are so many people in the Bay Area doing amazing work to stop it. And I think that's what really sustains us in this effort, is to help that move forward.
Do you have an estimate of how many victims there are in the Bay Area or in California even?
It's such an underground issue. It's the data for that kind of thing is just not available.
So who is monitoring this situation? Who is there? Does the government, or who's monitoring it?
So everybody can play a part. I think when we talk to people about what the role the general public can play, they can plug into, it's such a complex issue. We break it down into 3 areas: aftercare, intervention, and prevention. And so in aftercare, we're talking about the survivors.
Okay, this is almost working backwards in time.
Yes, aftercare.
Okay.
So start with the survivors. They need legal services, medical help, housing, job skills, therapy, and counseling. So there are groups in the Bay Area doing amazing jobs at aftercare. Like Freedom House has a shelter for women, and it has a shelter for youth now.
And where is Freedom House?
Well, the locations are secure,
of course,
for
sure.
security reasons, obviously. But CSEC is a acronym you'll hear: commercially sexually exploited children. So those are the minors who are trafficked. There's an organization called New Day for Children that works with CSEC. So
What
you've
is
got
it? New
Day
Day?
for Children. So aftercare is one piece of it, and people can get involved there. That they're doing things to fight it. Intervention is not just the law enforcement that's rescuing girls and sometimes boys, but there are many groups around the Bay Area that are reaching out to people in trafficking situations and providing them services so that they know that they can get out when the time comes. Like Missy has a drop-in center in Oakland. There's another group in Oakland called Love Never Fails. Because Justice Matters works in San Francisco, Sage does stuff there. And then you've got prevention, which is a really big I'll give you 5 quick areas of prevention that even though we need to serve the victims, it's hopefully we can prevent them from becoming victims in prevention. So I mentioned at-risk populations like foster care, runaways. There are groups that are serving those so that really to traffic-proof those populations. There are groups working on legislation so that we can have laws that better protect victims and laws that can better punish the perpetrators. There are groups working on demand. Why in the sex trafficking industry, why are men going out and buying sex, and how can we reduce that demand? We have the whole idea that there's slavery in the supply chain of many of the products we buy every day. And so as we become wiser consumers, we can actually make choices with our wallet to put a demand on businesses and corporations around the world to say, we want products that don't have slavery in the supply chain. And so that's a huge thing that everybody can do.
The YWCA has also got a very active program here in Santa Clara County on helping the victims and working to get them back into a more normal life.
Now, I've read where often, when young teenage kids come to the door and they're selling magazines, ostensibly to work their way through college, and that they're actually, are they being trafficked?
Yes, they are. I talked to the Sunnyvale police about this, and in the city of Sunnyvale, we have an ordinance that anyone who goes door to door must have a permit on them. And so when they come to the door, you need to ask if they are from what school they're from. And if they can't name a local school, there's a pretty good chance that they might have been a runaway that's been picked up, gathered together in a van, dropped off in an affluent neighborhood, and told to sell things. And then they're pulled back out. So always call your police and report if someone comes door to door and doesn't have a permit. That's really one of the best ways we can manage this and keep it out of our cities.
And do the police, either at the federal or the local level, are they proactively looking, seeking to stop this trade, or is it only reactive when somebody calls and says there was somebody here trying to sell magazines and he has no permit?
Well, why don't you tell them about Super Bowl?
Well, it depends on the agency, right? So there's a lot of federal government work, FBI, DHS are proactive. The local agencies, some are very and some aren't. We really kind of have this vision for mobilizing the public in the Bay Area to spread awareness and training, whether it's training of law enforcement, training of teachers, training of medical personnel, whatever it may be, service providers.
So how would someone in the public start to make the police more aware and insist that they have better training? How do you do that?
I went down and I volunteered. I wrote some grants when I was a teacher, and I said, I went in and asked to meet with the police chief and a couple of captains. They were very accommodating. We had a good discussion, and they said they needed money. And I said, well, how do you get money? Well, we get grants. And I said, I'm going to come and write grants for you. So I started 3 weeks ago.
Okay, so you're starting that part of
process, yeah.
So the public awareness.
Go ahead and tell me about you mentioned the Super Bowl.
Yeah, well, public awareness is the first step towards law enforcement being able to do interventions. The public can be the eyes and ears for law enforcement. So we really kind of find it helpful to give people this timeline. With Super Bowl 50 coming to the Bay Area in less than 2 years, people are talking about how the Super Bowl can be an event where traffickers take advantage of the opportunity to sell more of their victims. But regardless of the actual impact of the event, we really see it as an opportunity for people to say, hey, we need to do something now to maximize our effectiveness in fighting trafficking as the Super Bowl approaches. Then as it ends and goes away, we are in a better position to really sustain long-term in the fight for a slave-free Bay Area.
Okay, so you see this as an opportunity in a very good way. I mean, obviously a horrible thing, but an opportunity just to raise awareness on the part of law enforcement as well?
As well, and the hospitality industry. We are doing trainings in airports as people transport victims around, the travel
flight
industry.
attendants?
Right.
And what about flight attendants? What would they notice that you?
So the traffickers are often taking their victims around by airplane because you can travel with a minor on a plane easily. And so flight attendants are in the prime position or people that work at airports to spot when there's a suspicious situation where someone appears to be controlling someone, and they can report it.
Does that ever happen? Do they ever report it?
Yeah, so we've heard, when we did a training recently at the San Jose airport, they shared some cases where people were arrested. Yeah.
What effect has Prop 35 had on this? This was the anti-trafficking proposition.
One big effect, and one good effect is that it's mandating police training around the state.
Okay, so that's helping the police where they say we need money.
Yes.
But you have an example of the police who very recently said we don't have money. Please come in and write grants.
Yeah.
So,
Well, there also have been more cases brought to trial or prosecuted, and unfortunately, there was an unforeseen outcome of that, which we aren't. Which the way it manifested is that in my own town of Sunnyvale, we used to have 3 massage parlors. When the control over who was licensing the massage parlors went to a state agency, things are being held up a little slower. And during the time that has lapsed since then, we now have 26 massage parlors.
oh my, wow.
So the city is actively trying to pursue ways of regaining control over what goes on in the city and that particular industry.
Now, how can the average citizen get involved? I know you, come to one of your organizations or look up and volunteer. How else?
Yeah, so the BAATC trains BAATC ambassadors who are representatives around the Bay Area, different events, to learn how to talk about trafficking with people and help them engage. You can go to our website, which is baatc.org, to sign up for
BAATC.org.
Sign up for our monthly e-newsletter to talk about some of the things we're doing. We like to help people see that there's a timeline that they can do things in. We call it our 10-10-10. So what can you do in 10 minutes? What can you do in 10 days? What can you do in 10 months to fight trafficking? So, for example, in 10 minutes, you could put the anti-trafficking hotline in your phone number, in your phone. In 10 days, you could look at your pantry and think about what kind of choices you want to make to buy fair trade or slave-free. In 10 months, you can figure out how do you spread the word around, invite people to a film screening or read a book with you or something like that.
Okay, so let's start with the 10 minutes. You said you can put...
National Human Trafficking Hotline is what I meant to say, which is a centralized database in Washington, D.C. that collects calls where you can call in a tip.
So if you... We'll go back, Judith, to the restaurant. And you had some reason to suspect, although I assume that there was no way you could have suspected that, but maybe somehow
maybe you see
happened.
a young child working during the day when they should be at school.
Yeah.
And you think
Or
that's-
somebody
so
sitting
you
on a
can call
corner.
that human trafficking
Yes.
hotline that you've put in during the 10 minutes.
Oh, it's easy to remember too.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Okay.
Okay.
And then you're saying fair trade as well.
Fair trade.
You're buying fair trade because they are made, by definition, that's no human trafficking involved. Or
There's a good, clean supply chain.
Okay, well, I think this has given us some very good tips. You have been just great guests. Thank you so much, and thank you for watching AAUW Connections.
Thank you.